Something irreversible just happened in this war, and the Western media isn't telling you what it really means. Ukraine didn't just strike another military target deep inside Russia. They hit something that fundamentally alters Putin's strategic calculus for decades to come. We're not talking about oil refineries that can be rebuilt or ammunition depots that can be restocked. This is about infrastructure so critical, so impossible to replicate, that its loss represents a permanent degradation of Russian power projection capabilities. The implications ripple far beyond the battlefield. What Ukraine destroyed cannot be manufactured domestically, cannot be imported under current sanctions, and cannot be substituted with inferior alternatives without cascading failures across Russia's entire military-industrial complex. Putin now faces a choice between admitting this vulnerability to his own people or continuing a war with capabilities he knows are permanently compromised. This isn't propaganda. This isn't speculation. The satellite imagery, the Russian military communications, and the sudden silence from Moscow all tell the same story. Today, we're going to examine exactly what was hit, why it can never be replaced, and what this means for the trajectory of this conflict and the global order itself. Let me be very direct with you about what happened, because the way this story is being covered in the mainstream press completely misses the strategic significance of what we're witnessing. On the surface, reports came through about yet another Ukrainian strike deep inside Russian territory. Most people scrolled past it. Another explosion, another fire, another day in this grinding conflict that seems to have no end. But if you understand the actual target that was hit, if you comprehend what that facility represented in terms of Russia's long-term military capabilities, you realize we just witnessed a turning point that will echo through the next decade of geopolitical arrangements. The facility in question is one of Russia's specialized manufacturing plants for turbine components used in naval propulsion systems. Now, I know that sounds technical and perhaps even boring to some, but stay with me because this matters enormously. These aren't just any turbines. We're talking about the gas turbine engines that power Russia's most advanced warships, including their frigates and corvettes that carry caliber cruise missiles. These are the vessels that project Russian naval power not just in the Black Sea but across the Mediterranean and into the Indian Ocean. Without these specific turbines, Russia cannot build new ships of this class and cannot adequately maintain the ones they already have in service. Here's where it gets even more critical. Before 2014, Russia was actually dependent on Ukraine for these turbine systems. The Zorya Mashprug plant in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, was the primary manufacturer. When Russia annexed Crimea and the war in Donbass began, Ukraine immediately cut off all turbine exports to Russia. This forced Moscow into a desperate scramble to develop domestic production capabilities. They invested billions of rubles and nearly a decade of effort to build these manufacturing facilities on Russian soil. The plant that Ukraine just struck was the crown jewel of that effort, representing years of technological transfer, equipment procurement from countries willing to skirt sanctions, and the painful assembly of expertise that Russia had allowed to atrophy during the years when they could simply buy what they needed from Ukraine. Think about the timeline here. Russia started working on this problem in 2014. It took them until 2018 to even produce a prototype. By 2020, they were still struggling with quality control issues. The turbines they manufactured domestically were less efficient, less reliable, and required more maintenance than the Ukrainian versions they had depended on for decades. But they persisted because they had no choice. The alternative was to see their naval shipbuilding program grind to a complete halt. By 2022, when the full-scale invasion began, they had finally achieved something approaching adequate domestic production. Not excellent, not matching Western or even Ukrainian standards, but functional enough to keep their naval ambitions alive. And now that capability has been severely damaged, possibly destroyed entirely depending on how successful Ukraine's strike really was. The machinery required to manufacture these turbines cannot be ordered from a catalog. We're talking about specialized precision equipment, much of it originally imported from Germany, Italy, and Japan before sanctions made such transfers impossible. The engineers who understand how to operate this equipment and maintain the incredibly tight tolerances required for turbine blade manufacturing represent a knowledge base that took years to develop. If that facility is truly gone, if the equipment is destroyed and the expertise scattered, Russia faces the prospect of starting over from scratch, and this time they have to do it under the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. But let's go deeper into why this matters so much. Naval power isn't just about fighting other ships, it's about power projection, about the ability to influence events far from your own borders. Russia's Navy, particularly their Black Sea Fleet and their Mediterranean Squadron, has been absolutely central to their strategy in Syria, their influence in North Africa, and their ability to threaten NATO's southern flank. Those Caliber cruise missiles that I mentioned, the ones launched from frigates powered by these exact turbines, have been used extensively in the Syrian conflict and have been a constant presence in Russia's arsenal throughout the Ukraine war itself. They represent one of the few areas where Russia achieved something close to parity with Western precision strike capabilities. Without the ability to build more ships equipped with these systems, without the ability to properly maintain the ships they already have, Russia's naval future suddenly looks far more constrained. The vessels they have now will age, will require increasingly extensive repairs using components that no longer exist, and will eventually have to be retired without replacement. This doesn't happen overnight. We're talking about a process that unfolds over years. But the trajectory is now set, and it points in only one direction. Russia's Navy will shrink, its capabilities will diminish, and its ability to influence events in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond will contract accordingly. Now, some of you might be thinking, can't Russia just import what they need? Can't they turn to China or Iran or North Korea to fill this gap? This is where we need to understand the realities of defense industrial production. China has its own naval turbine technology, certainly, and it's advancing rapidly. But Chinese naval turbines are designed for Chinese ships, built to Chinese specifications, integrated into Chinese combat management systems. You can't just drop a Chinese turbine into a Russian frigate any more than you can put a Toyota engine into a Ford and expect everything to work perfectly. The integration challenges alone would require years of engineering work, extensive redesign of existing hull structures, and the development of entirely new maintenance protocols and supply chains. Moreover, China has been extremely careful about the kind of support it provides to Russia. Beijing has been willing to buy Russian oil and gas at a discount, certainly. They've maintained diplomatic support in international forums. But when it comes to providing military technology that could directly extend Russia's ability to wage war, especially technology that could lead to secondary sanctions on Chinese companies, Beijing has been far more cautious. The Chinese government is not interested in jeopardizing its access to Western technology and Western markets for the sake of helping Russia rebuild a naval capability that ultimately doesn't serve Chinese interests anyway. And here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions about Russia's military-industrial capacity. The Soviet Union, for all its many flaws and ultimate failure as a system, had created an incredibly sophisticated and largely self-sufficient defense industrial base. When the USSR collapsed, that integrated system was shattered. The factories that made components for missiles were suddenly in different countries. The research institutes that developed new technologies found themselves cut off from the manufacturing facilities that could produce them. Ukraine inherited a huge portion of this industrial base, particularly in the aerospace and naval sectors. For the past 30 years, Russia has been trying to reconstitute this capability entirely within its own borders, but it's been a constant struggle. They've had successes, certainly. Their missile technology remains formidable. Their electronic warfare capabilities are genuinely impressive. But in many areas, particularly in precision manufacturing and advanced materials, they never fully closed the gap. They remained dependent on imports, both overt and covert, to fill critical needs. The turbine facility that just got hit represented one of the rare successes in this reconstitution effort, a case where Russia had actually managed to replicate a capability they had lost, and now it's gone. Let's talk about what this means for the broader trajectory of the war. One of the persistent questions throughout this conflict has been about Russia's ability to sustain a long-term military effort. Can they keep producing missiles, artillery shells, armored vehicles, all the materiel required to keep hundreds of thousands of troops in the field? The answer has been more complicated than either side wants to admit. Russia has demonstrated far more resilience than many Western analysts predicted. They've ramped up production, they've found ways around sanctions, they've mobilized their economy in ways that seemed impossible in the early months of the war. But there's a difference between sustaining current operations and maintaining long-term strategic capabilities. Russia can probably keep making artillery shells for years, as crude as that sounds. Artillery shell production is relatively low-tech. It can be distributed across many facilities, and the manufacturing requirements are not particularly sophisticated. But high-end military systems are a different story entirely. These require specialized facilities, specialized expertise, and supply chains that are increasingly difficult for Russia to maintain under sanctions. Every time Ukraine successfully strikes one of these critical nodes, one of these irreplaceable facilities, they're not just causing immediate damage, they're foreclosing future options for Russia. They're ensuring that 10 years from now, 15 years from now, Russia's military will be weaker than it would have been otherwise. This is strategic attrition at the highest level, and it's the kind of damage that doesn't appear on any battlefield map, but that ultimately determines the outcome of great power competition. There's also a psychological dimension to this that shouldn't be underestimated. The Russian population has been told repeatedly that their country is strong, that Western sanctions are failing, that Russia is weathering this storm and emerging more independent and more powerful than before. There's a certain narrative coherence to this story that has helped maintain public support for the war despite its enormous costs. But strikes like this one, attacks that hit deep inside Russia and destroy facilities that represent years of investment and effort, these events undermine that narrative. They create doubt. They make people question whether the sacrifices being demanded of them are actually leading anywhere productive. Putin's government will do everything they can to minimize the significance of this strike, to claim that the damage was limited, that production will resume shortly, that this is merely a temporary setback. But the engineers who worked at that facility know better. The military planners who were counting on continued production of these turbines know better. And increasingly, as information flows even in Russia's controlled media environment, the public is starting to understand that something is fundamentally not working in this war effort. Now, I want to address something that I know troubles a lot of people who are watching this conflict. There's a tendency, particularly in Western media, to frame every Ukrainian success as an unalloyed victory for the forces of good against evil. And there's a corresponding tendency among those skeptical of the Western narrative to frame every Ukrainian action as a provocation, as an escalation that risks nuclear war, as something that serves American imperial interests rather than Ukrainian survival. Both of these framings miss the actual complexity of what's happening. Ukraine is fighting for its existence as an independent nation. That's not propaganda, that's just reality. When Russian forces invaded in February 2022, they were driving toward Kyiv with the clear intention of decapitating the Ukrainian government and installing a puppet regime. Ukraine fought back with remarkable courage and effectiveness and forced Russia to abandon that objective. Since then, the war has become a grinding attritional struggle over territory in the east and south. Ukraine's strikes deep into Russia, including this attack on the turbine facility, are not escalation in any meaningful sense. They are legitimate military operations against a country that is actively invading them, occupying their territory, and launching missiles at their cities daily. At the same time, we need to be honest about the fact that this war serves various interests beyond Ukrainian independence. The United States and NATO have their own reasons for supporting Ukraine, reasons that include weakening Russia as a geopolitical rival, testing weapon systems in actual combat, and reinforcing the transatlantic alliance. These interests can coexist with genuine support for Ukrainian sovereignty, but they also mean that decisions about the war are being made in Washington, London, and Brussels as much as they are in Kyiv. The weapons Ukraine uses to strike these targets come from Western arsenals. The intelligence that identifies these targets comes from Western surveillance systems. This is not purely a Ukrainian operation in isolation. What makes this particular strike so significant is that it represents a kind of warfare that Russia is fundamentally not prepared for. The Soviet military doctrine that still underpins much of Russian thinking was built around the idea of massive ground offensives, of overwhelming firepower concentrated at breakthrough points, of accepting enormous casualties in pursuit of operational objectives. It was never designed to deal with a more nimble adversary capable of striking critical infrastructure hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. Russia's air defense systems are extensive, but they were designed primarily to intercept aircraft and ballistic missiles, not the kind of drones and cruise missiles that Ukraine has been using with increasing effectiveness. And here's what really keeps Russian military planners awake at night. Ukraine's capabilities in this regard are only going to improve. They're developing longer-range systems. They're getting better at identifying critical targets. They're learning from each strike, refining their tactics, improving their success rates. Meanwhile, Russia's ability to protect these facilities is fundamentally limited. You cannot put air defense systems around every important factory in a country as vast as Russia. You cannot keep every critical facility hidden from satellite surveillance. You cannot prevent determined attackers from eventually finding a way through your defenses. This asymmetry is going to shape the rest of this conflict and whatever comes after it. Even if the war ends tomorrow, even if some kind of negotiated settlement freezes the current lines of control, Ukraine will retain the capability and the motivation to strike targets inside Russia. And Russia will have to live with the knowledge that facilities like this turbine plant, infrastructure that took years and billions to build, can be destroyed in a single successful strike. That's a strategic vulnerability that no amount of nuclear saber-rattling can address. Let me bring this back to the bigger picture, because ultimately that's what matters most. We are living through a period of fundamental transformation in the global order. The post-Cold War consensus, the idea that we had reached some kind of end of history where liberal democracy and market capitalism would gradually encompass the entire world, that consensus is dead. What replaces it is still being determined, and conflicts like the one in Ukraine are part of that determination process. Russia entered this war believing that the West was weak, decadent, and unwilling to make real sacrifices to defend the international order. They believed that European dependence on Russian energy would prevent any meaningful response to their invasion. They believed that Western unity would fracture, that sanctions would be limited and ineffective, that Ukraine would collapse within days or weeks. All of these assumptions have proven wrong, and strikes like this one on the turbine facility are concrete manifestations of just how wrong they were. But let's not kid ourselves about where this is headed. Russia is not going to collapse. Putin's regime, for all its brutality and incompetence, retains substantial domestic support and maintains effective control over the country's security apparatus. What we're seeing instead is a gradual degradation of Russian power, a slow-motion recognition that their ambitions exceeded their capabilities, and an eventual adjustment to a more constrained role in global affairs. The loss of this turbine facility is one more step in that process, one more reduction in Russia's future options, One more limitation on their ability to project power beyond their borders. For those of us watching from outside, trying to understand where this conflict leads, the destruction of irreplaceable infrastructure like this matters more than the daily reports of artillery exchanges or incremental territorial gains. These are the events that determine what the world looks like in 2030, in 2035, in 2040. Russia, without the ability to build modern naval vessels, is a different kind of power than Russia with that capability. It's more regional, more defensive, more focused on protecting what it has rather than expanding its influence. And that shift, multiplied across dozens of similar losses and constraints, is what defeat looks like for a nuclear power in the 21st century. Not occupation, not regime change, but a gradual recognition of diminished status and reduced options, locked in by the destruction of things that can never be replaced.